I am Gary Burnett. We're a partnership of 27 land trusts in the Central Rockies. You'll see a map later that shows the geography, but hopefully what we're doing to sort of bring a strategy for the members together might have some application here in your landscape. So as we go through this, we'll see if that pans out or not. I think it's just this right button, right? Yeah. So pretty simple mission we have. That's to ensure connected habitats and working land for people and wildlife by increasing the pace of conservation in the Central Rockies. Now, I want to point out those are and statements. This is not about one or the other. This is about working land and connected habitats and people and wildlife. That's important for us in our mission. We've been around 20 years, so we're going to celebrate 20 years this year. And in the core work we do with the partnership has been to provide them access to science, capacity, and capital over this 20 years. Now, way back when, 20 years ago, some of the state associations weren't around. Land Trust Alliance program wasn't as strong. And so we were the sort of entity saying, how can we build up the capacity of the land trust in the Central Rockies? We distributed about $1.5 million worth of grants, funded 65 different positions in those land trusts. And at this point now, Western Land, the Land Trust Alliance program is very strong, and we continue to work directly with Land Trust Alliance. But they're going to be sort of the capacity builders at this point moving forward for the Central Rockies. We're going to focus our efforts on capital. So three things about this slide. I missed in redoing this slide. I missed the third element. Third element would be habitat stewardship or habitat suitability. But I'm going to talk mostly about this idea of reduced subdivision. But I want to point out what Brandon and Pat talked about in this second line item, and this idea of conflict reduction through attractants. We have a pretty strong program of work that came from our work at the Blackfoot Challenge. We built a pretty big program in the Southwest Montana with 10 landowner-led groups and continue to work on trying to extend that work. Essentially, we're trying to sustain and increase access to funding for those groups. I'll just mention we're writing an interim practice standard for what's called non-lethal predator management has been written and submitted by Tom Watson, the State Conservationist of Montana. So hopefully they get applied and there'll be access for producers directly to these techniques. So this is the problem for us. I'm going to show you what we think the need is and give you an idea what the solution might be, at least for what we're thinking. We developed a model. It's 315 million acres. So if you had data across 350 million acres, you wouldn't need a model. But data is sporadic throughout that area. So as we get more data, we're going to lean more on data in terms of finding the priority areas. But the model indicates it's been peer vetted. There's 23 million acres of private land that are suitable for wildlife connectivity in the 350 million acre Central Rockies. We think a minimum of 500,000 acres will be lost in the next 10 years. That's based on 1 acre, a house on 1 acre. And so house on 1 acre could affect 5, 10 or more acres. So that's sort of a minimum loss, if you will. And so that's the crisis of fragmentation of habitats in the Central Rockies. And what we think we need in terms of protection or maintaining this working landscape is the scientists have given us a benchmark, 30%, right? And so scientists are saying there's climate change. They're saying there's a need to retain biodiversity. So for us, it's contextual. It gives us a benchmark to look to. It's important in terms of our calculations, in terms of how we think, how much more we think we need to be doing to secure these working lands. So the numbers, if you play out the 30% and then go back to 23 million acres, that means we roughly need 7 million acres of connectivity across private land and the working landscape in the Central Rockies. And the land trusts have done about 2 million acres work with private landowners based on connectivity. That gives you 5 million acres to go. What I want you to do is think about how this case for the Central Rockies might apply for the case for Gunnison Sage-Grouse. So the end goal, of course, is that we need to increase the pace. Right now, the members are conserving about 120,000 acres of working land a year, and we think that needs to be about 500,000 acres if we're going to meet that benchmark. And so the solution is pretty straightforward. If you're a land trust, access to capital makes it feasible for land trusts to work on conservation priorities. North American Wetland Conservation Act, agricultural land easement practice. 2 stellar examples. If you want land trusts to work on those conservation priorities, you need to make sure there's money for those projects, or that it's just not feasible for them to work with landowners and create false hope for that landowner that they can secure an easement and maintain that working landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some process we got to this point. There's a lot going on in this slide. So this is our landscape, 350 million acres. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is you're seeing the objectives that the different projects might have. And they're an assemblage of objectives. Some are big game projects for connectivity. Some might be migratory birds. Some might be large ungulates. And they might have any of those suite of characteristics in the project. What you see in the middle is the map that shows the location of the first portfolio, we call it, of projects. You also see the connectivity layer, which is the pointer. That little guy. Okay, so see the orange color? That's the model, and you can see the public land and private land is not filled in. And so what you see on the right-hand side is a list of the members. Of course, each member has a project in the portfolio. I'll talk about that in a little bit. What I want to give you an idea is how long did it take us to build this and who we built it with. We started the conversation with members in 2018. It's a very interactive process with the members. Can I make that show up again without just moving the slide? Oh, what am I doing to make that show up again? Oh, there you go. All right, thank you for having my back on that. And so in 2018, we started the conversation with the members. And to go back in time, we did some prioritizations back in 2010, and they create those kind of scary maps that they begin to look like you're targeting individual properties. And so they were so potentially dangerous that they were hard to be usable because you couldn't really show them. In fact, some of the members didn't even know we'd done the prioritization. So we sort of said, let's approach this a different way. And we talked to the members about what they need. It's important to note we talked to funders at the same time about what they need. So this process of developing Keep It Connected was with the land trust and with a group of funders. It's very important to note that. So what we're doing is, as Seth alluded to, is the funders like this because we've sorted through, if you will, the wildlife connectivity projects and are presenting the best of those to funders. And you'll see exactly how that's presented here in just a second. This is the website. So along the way, funders said, you're going to have a website. And so you're displaying very sensitive information. You're going to see a couple of project maps here in a little bit. And that data share, we have a data share agreement with our members. We can show data. I have approval to show the data I'm going to show you, but I couldn't give you those slides electronically. And if you tried to access, I said most people in this room, if they tried to register to that website, wouldn't be allowed access. And so we sort through that, and only funders can get access to the back side of this website, because what you're going to see is essentially a vacation rental by owner type of website, and funders can sort through that. You can look at state, they can look at species, they can look at geography, conservation easement purchase, and they can sort through that and they can find project gaps. And the very basic idea is you're increasing the pace of conservation of private land agreements in the Central Rockies. And would the land trust close their financial gap over time? 9 out of 10 times they would, or whatever that would be relatively. Would it take them a longer time? It would take them a longer time. And what the members have said is they can feel the pace increasing. You'll see some of the numbers here in just a little bit. So let me show you 4 projects to give you an idea of a little bit of a snapshot of what donors might see when they see this website. And they'll see a little more information of this just to show you what's going on. The project is right here. On the map. One of the recommendations to one of the funders is make that open so you can see the rest of the landscape. So we've done that. I could show you the slide as it was, because what culminated in the discussion with the members and the land trust was a donor-hosted webinar in January of 2019. So technically, that's the hard launch of Keep It Connected. So when we made that webinar presentation, every single slide that we showed in the presentation was vetted and approved by that land trust. And so in this case, Nature Conservancy Canada said, you can show folks this slide. Now I realize it's a webinar, but you can take a snapshot, a screenshot of a slideshow. And so we were very careful about holding this data tightly, and we still are very careful about that. And so on the slide, you can see you can see in this case, it's a large carnivore project. It's an ungulate project. It's a wetland bird project. You can see who the entity is, what generally the name of the project, how many acres it is it a fee purchase? Most of them are conservation easements. You can see the project value, and most importantly, you can see their funding gap. And for Nature Conservancy Canada, this was a public process, a public project already. So they said you can show the slide the way it is. On this next slide here, you can see there is no project location. Because at the time this was not done, and Vaudegran said you can show this, but you've got to take the project location off the map. So this is what we showed in the January of 2021 presentation. What you're also seeing is showing up local data. So you see that the model here, but local data is very strong here that says grizzly bears are moving across this landscape. They have point data on their project location. So we're looking for a combination of intersection with the model and intersection with local data. And we always want to get more data as we go forward. You also see something interesting. You see this icon show up. That's a climate resilience icon. That means this project hits the Nature Conservancy Climate Resilient Database. So this project is called Bozeman Pass, and it's Scout Valley Land Trust project. This project is just closing. You can see all the assemblage of different conservation projects that have occurred, and you get the idea. You're trying to complete this corridor, if you will, across this highway here. And the project essentially is those parcels right there. They're just about done with it. There's an interesting story. We're trying to attract funders, and funders want to attract funders. And so one of our funders put up $75,000 match for this project, which generated 2 other gifts from 2 other funders for a total of, I think, $230,000 additional dollars. There's another project in North Idaho, same thing, another funder put up match for a project that attracted another $200,000 of private funding to close that project. And then last one here, this is a really good example of local data. This is the Wyoming Migration Initiative data. And so here you can see it kind of overlaps with the model, but it really overlaps, right? It's 5,000 mule deer walk through that property at any one time. This is a good example of Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust closed this project on their own because that's what the land trusts are actively doing. These are active projects. The way you get in the portfolio is we talk to each individual land trust and basically go through the mechanism saying how does it function for wildlife connectivity. It's important to note we serve land trusts. We're making this easy for land trusts. This is not a hard process. We want it to be easy to get in the portfolio. We want it easy to get money to land trusts, and we make it easy to close their agreements and move on to the next one. That's the basic model. And this is what's happened since about a year ago. So we generated about almost $6 million in project funding. We've distributed all that. Total project acres, 181,000 acres. Almost 100 million acres of project, $100 million of project value. Total projects closed 17, and we contributed to 23 more. It means they didn't quite close yet. And leverage of 1 to 17. That leverage factor is important to funders. They want to know their money's going a long ways. Yeah. And so those numbers are a good first start. We hope it's an indication of things to come. We've gotten 2 gifts from one funder. We've gotten 1 gift from another funder. Looks like they're going to come back in the fall. Both those funders in the fall. There's another funder looking in the fall to maybe make a contribution. And I just want to make one more point. The funders, we've always said from the beginning, you can give the money to us and we'll distribute it to the land trusts. There's no overhead. We do this for free. We're not charging overhead. We don't take a cut out of the capital. This is all for the land trusts. Or you can give the money directly to the land trusts. In the second round from the first funder, they gave us $500,000 and we distributed 2 projects. And they distributed $3.8 million directly to the land trust for their portfolio projects, for their Keep It Connected projects. So that's it for my presentation. I want to show you these slides because that helps me start to get my head around how does this apply to Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. And I think the advantage you have is you have a pretty tight landscape. You have a really good understanding of where the habitat is, where the birds are. you have an idea of what you've done, and you certainly understand who owns that property. And so for me, thinking about that, how do you build your case in terms of what is needed for Gunnison sage-grouse? How much do you think the scientists say you need? That's an important question. You have criteria. Kathy reviewed some of those criteria in terms of which projects you might be a priority. And so instead of using a map to say where are those places, if the land trusts were interested, somebody collects those projects. Somebody like us for the land trust, I don't know who that entity is for the land trust, organizes this program, and they submit their applications, if you will, to the portfolio. And at some point, if you followed the same model, you'd have a donor access website where donors could take a look at it. Now, I'm going to pause and say, remember, the strategy was built with members and with funders. So you would need some Seth Gallaghers and others to work with to say, how do you build this? What do funders want to see? And what are they looking to access? And I think that's it. So what time is it? Because I think we got a lot of time. Cool. Candida Fund, who's closing, as some of you may know, was the first funder. Tim Stevens was a big partner, as what we call the funder team. Liz Claiborne-Ortenberg was another funder. Been talking to that funding source for a couple of years now. We just completed distribution of their final $1 million gift, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk to them actually in a couple of days and see what's next. Some of the other funders are Arthur and Blank Philanthropies is very interested in what we're doing. Peter Brown was part of that funding team. Liz Bell, who used to be at Wilberforce, is still on contract with them, was part of that funding team. Gary Wolf was at Cinnabar, and Andrea Keller-Helsel at Hewlett Foundation. I think I mentioned them all. And so some of those are operational funders, and some of those are capital funders. So Hewlett's not a capital funder. Wilberforce is not a capital funder. But operationally, that's why we don't have to take any cut, because we get our operational support from those funders. But Candida is a capital funder. Claiborne-Ortenberg is a capital funder. A&B West is. Knobloch Family Foundation is interested in what we're doing. There's other funders that are looking at what we're doing. And our funder team is saying, just be patient. We're kind of anxious. I'm a fundraiser. I've been doing it for a long time. I want it to happen like right now, right? And the funders are saying the word's getting out. Take it easy. Don't worry about it. And we're just following their lead. We're following very directly the funders' recommendations in terms of how to continue with this. Now, as you can imagine, we're not public about this yet. In fact, we formed a separate foundation to accept these funds so it wouldn't upset our public charity tests. But the foundation board, I sought approval from that new Heart of the Rockies Foundation board to have this presentation, because we technically are not communicating this publicly. It's not a public case, it's a funder case. But at some point, we are going to become more aggressive in terms of a public model, in terms of where this out there. But it's not really the general public we're trying to reach. It's funders that want to make investments. And in particular, what they're interested in is they can close projects. A land trust works a long time to get that 90%. That last 10 or 5 or 10%, it could take them a couple of years to raise that last bit of money. And at that time, sometimes landowners get tired of that process, and you don't want that to happen. And so the whole idea is to close that gap quicker, and we've been able to close some pretty good gaps so far. And the idea is we need to attract more funding and more leverage. And of course, at some point, private funding is not enough. We know we need an increase in public support.
Thanks. This sounds like a really good endeavor you're doing, and I'm really glad for it. You may not be aware, and I don't know how many others are aware, that here in the Valley, we have a funding source for preservation projects, and it is called the Gunnison Valley Land Preservation Fund. It has a board made up of two entities from each of, or two people from each of the entities in the Valley. So that's a board of 8. and different projects come to us. It's the Land Trust, the Legacy, anyone else that's into conservation. The money comes from a tax, actually, a small percentage of a tax that voters approved twice now. So it started in 1997. It was reapproved in 2012. It'll need to come up for a vote again in 2033, I believe. And every year it raises, right about now, I don't have any exact numbers, but between $300,000 and $400,000 that we allocate to the different projects, whereby they can use the money we give them to leverage with Great Outdoors Colorado, for example. And it's a return of about 12 to 1 on our donations. So I just wanted to mention that because it sounds similar to what you're doing, only it's a very public thing, right, not a private thing. But you might try to get that going where you live, or we might try to get going what you have where we live. But it's protected an awful lot of acreage around here. Most of the Tomichi Valley, Tomichi Creek Valley, a lot of Ohio Creek, good sage-grouse habitat.
So it sounds to me like, correct me if I'm wrong, like a county open space bond in similar fashion, because we're familiar with those because we've helped support some of those, and various counties around our service area have those. Well,
it's not just the county, it's the city of Gunnison, the town of Crested Butte, town of Mount Crested Butte, and the county. So it's a collaboration among the 4 entities. So it's not just a county thing.
We should keep talking, because I'm sure we'd love to hear more about what you're doing there, and if there's anything we can do to help, we'd be more than glad to do that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you.
So the good thing about it is we don't have to raise the money every year.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And money what comes to mind is match. Match is hard for some land trusts, right? And so we're providing some match. We're playing around with the idea with a couple funders of some land trusts can access ALE, Agricultural Land Easement, and RCP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and some can't. It's a pretty big lift, particularly 50-50 is just out of reach for some land trusts, even if it went to 75-25, which we think it should. And so we're playing around with the idea, could we have a match fund, particularly accessible for land trusts that can't access those funds traditionally? And at that point, in their ALE and RCPP applications, they could obligate against that fund. And as well, we invest that fund, we would use the interest from that to fund a small grants due diligence program for land trusts. So we're just playing around with that idea. Hopefully this fall that'll come to pass. And you can ask me carcass pickup questions, because I do enjoy that program.
I want to ask you a carcass question, but I'm going to ask you a different question. All right. I like the strategic part of this where you had like a goal of 30% protection of the landscape, and then I'm just curious on how much resolution there is in that strategy. Like with 2 things: what particular properties or locations within that landscape you're trying to protect, and then do you even have that information? Like, do you know where the strategic locations are for your various goals?
Are you saying when the model gets to the ground, how accurate is it?
Yeah, or just what's the resolution? You know specifically on the ground what needs to be protected. It's one thing to protect the 30%, but where? It's
not very fine. And our modeler, Brian Beltran, our Conservation Equity Director, would say, when you try to model 315 million acres, it sort of breaks down when you get on the ground. And so he's very clear about it being relative, and you're looking at the fit, particularly when you don't have data, and you're looking to the land trust to say, what else do you have? And so it's a very iterative process with the land trust. Again, we're making it easy to get in the portfolio. These are our members. We want to serve them and move their project forward. So it's not hard to get in the portfolio, but the portfolio has to select wildlife connectivity projects. The donors, as Seth alluded to, are counting on us being an honest broker between the land trust and the funders. Yeah. So that's why data is so important. If we could get access to more data, we wouldn't have to rely on models. Yeah. You can ask me that carcass pickup question if you want. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I've kind of had some experience dealing with the conservation easement process, really as a biologist and then as kind of an intermediary and into the real estate part of it. But with a lot of the Gunnison sage-grouse populations, particularly the satellite populations, they're very small, and the areas that you really need to protect are small as well and very confined. Mm-hmm. I know you've got a whole list there of everything from the wetlands to the migration to, but when you get down to Gunnison sage-grouse, it's a very small area. And you talked right off the bat about not painting a target on a landowner, but unfortunately that seems to be almost where we start when we're talking about land conservation, because of these private properties that hold, to us, 1,000 acres of sagebrush. This can be very significant. Do you have any advice how, to approach those landowners and say, try to sell them an easement or sell them on the idea? Or do you just sit back and kind of wait and hope, maybe that they'll come to you?
So we're not a land trust, right? We don't hold easements. We serve land trusts. What I hear land trusts saying is they prefer to wait for landowners to come to them. They have this thing they call it, it's not community-based conservation, but it's the idea that the first easement in a locale is the hardest one to get, because landowners just don't, it sounds too good to be true. I mean, it's like, really, you're going to pay me not to put houses here and I don't really want them anyway? Yeah, that's right. That's the way it works, right? And it just seems ridiculous, right? How could that really be true? And so word of mouth tends to be the way most land trusts talk about it. The first easement might be a big stretch for a landowner in that community. And a couple years later, they're still in business. The fence seems to be in good shape. New pickup driving to the cafe, and the neighbor might go, so how's that working for you, right? And that's the way land trusts feel like it mostly is successful, because landowners have every right not to trust us in terms of showing up, right? And so once you build that trust, it's different. I mean, what landowners want to know is, do we want them there? And once they trust that, that's different, right? But they don't necessarily trust the fact that we want them there. We do, and well, I think everybody in this room does, but that's not always the case.
So if we're trying to, I know with Parks and Wildlife has had a program for purchasing easements for a number of years, but you submit proposals, those proposals are evaluated. Some of them they fund, a lot of them they don't. Is there an opportunity to, with this sort of a setup, to maybe pass some of those things along that a lot of times it's cost? We're talking about property up around Telluride. It's going, for $15,000 or $20,000 an acre fee title, and they're wanting $10,000 or $15,000 for an easement.
Yeah.
Is that someplace where you guys would step in and say, okay, I know my hedge fund manager buddy over here, and he can come in and step in where Parks and Wildlife simply can't afford it?
Well, hopefully that is what we're sort of leaning into, is trying to find access to more funding. I get to say that land trusts are good at this, right? I mean, they're in the business of doing this, and we're not any better than they are at it. We hopefully can leverage our relationships and grow our relationships that way. What you're alluding to a little bit is the cost of easements, and easement valuation is an important concept. If the easement's not worth much, most landowners that I've talked to aren't really interested in a permanent easement if you're going to get $100 or $200 an acre. But if you're going to get paid a fairly substantial amount and continue to operate that land, that's attractive. The question you're asking is, where do you come up with that kind of money? And it's not going to get any cheaper. I mean, it's part of the solution. So The more we can do now, the better off it's going to be. And the more we don't do that, the more working land we're going to lose, and the more wildlife habitat we're going to lose. So it's a complicated situation, but our basic point when I first started to funders about this and we identified those numbers, and I said, I think it's this number, I think it's $1 billion a year. The funder, who's a big funder, said, stop saying that because you're going to scare people away. And it's like, the point is that's what it's going to take to retain this working landscape for wildlife is that kind of money. And so I don't think private's can't save the day. They might contribute 10 to 20%, but if public values these places, they're going to have to make the contribution. So I think that's how we're going to get there.
We have a question from the distance. In addition to the private funders that are providing funds, what other sources of funding do land trusts commonly obtain? Does NRCS ALE funding make up a portion of the funding that the land trusts are utilizing? If so, is it a common source?
Agricultural land easement practice is a growing source. It's a good example of if you want to secure agricultural land, put up money for agricultural land easements. You want to secure wetlands, North American Wetland Conservation Act, put up money for wetlands. You want to secure wildlife habitat, wildlife connectivity, put up money for wildlife connectivity, and land trusts will work in those places. NRCS ALE program is a great program. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program got a little clunky in the last Farm Bill. We're hoping to rectify that and make it a little more accessible. But agricultural land easement practice is a very relatively accessible program. The challenge is match. In certain cases, some small entities just can't come up with match. I'll tell you the story in Montana. As some of you may know, Montana uses more agricultural land easement than any state. The way they've really done that is they hired a coordinator. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation helps fund that coordinator. And that coordinator helps the land trusts work through the process with NRCS of an agricultural conservation easement. And they help them dot the I's and cross the T's. And at this point now, Montana worked on more agricultural land easement acres last year than the rest of the country combined. And it's because they have a strong focus on what the process is in terms of making those applications. And they're aggressive about making applications, and they complete them, and they grow their allocation every year. And so that's what we hope everybody can do. Wyoming, Idaho, all of our service areas are very interested in trying to follow that same model and increase access to agricultural land easement. And hopefully they'll continue to be a favorable match in 75-25 or maybe even 80-20. I'd say the other program that they tap, land and water conservation funding, is in some cases a very important program. The more places that the Fish and Wildlife Service can secure a footprint, the more ability you can use that easement program along with other agency programs. And so that's a pretty significant opportunity to leverage more land and water conservation funding. We're hopeful that more funding will become available from the public, but we'll wait to see if that's going to happen or not. I think Pat's up again.
So if it's okay with Kathy and Seth, can I do it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I am curious about the carcass project you have going there. And I guess two things. One, can you just talk a little bit more about what it is and what the main sort of opportunities and challenges are facing that project? And then I'm also more specifically curious about if it's for livestock and wildlife. And then if it's for wildlife, are there any concerns about chronic wasting disease or other things in the carcasses that you might not want to let get out of a carcass pile?
I'll answer the first one first, and then you can remind me your first question second, because I forgot what it was already. That's what happens when you get old. So we work a lot with, in some cases, Department of Transportation. The classic site that I'm familiar with is in the Blackfoot. It's a Department of Transportation site because of roadkill. And so they needed a way to dispose of and compost roadkill. And there's quite a few compost sites around the state. And so Blackfoot Challenge at the time partnered up with Montana Department of Transportation, said, you have a compost facility. Can we help enhance that site, bring water to it, fence it? It's important, the idea of the ravens and what you call it, subsidies. It's good to fence those sites because bears like those sites. And so bears don't like electric fences. So put an electric fence around it, you can keep bears out of that. But they do keep those separate, the domestic and the wild, they're separate piles. They can use the wild off-site. They can't use the domestic off-site yet. Or the other way around. It'll be the other way around, yeah. So what's the first question? How do we get going?
And you just answered it a little bit, but just more generally, what is the project and what are some of the big, I guess, challenges mostly, but also opportunities associated with it?
Yeah, so it's really two things. The basic practice is carcass removal, dead stock removal. Composting is just a way to dispose of it. It's not really the conservation practice per se, although it is built, and we are hoping it's built into the new non-lethal predator management practice. They have an animal mortality facility practice that you might be able to modify for that practice purposes. But the idea is, particularly in springtime, you have natural loss, livestock loss, and sometimes a lot of calves. And so the basic idea is somebody comes around with a truck and picks up those dead calves seasonally. Out of season, they'll Fish Run Parks or Blackfoot Challenge will come pick up the occasional cow or horse through the off season, and they take those to the compost facility. It's a fully self-funded program by the Blackfoot Challenge to pick those up. Partners program helps with that. Other funding sources help with that program. But the basic idea of disposal is they used to tip them in the landfill. And the landfill was willing to keep doing that, but it cost somebody to do that. So it's less expensive to partner up with the Department of Transportation that's maintaining the site, because that's a little problematic. Now, I will say of the other 4 compost sites that I'm familiar with, none of the other ones are with Department of Transportation. They're all either independent. Madison Valley Ranchland Group has one. Sailors Kootenai Tribes would like to get one. There's one in Deer Lodge that's working with a compost facility already and taking additional dead stock and working it into their compost. And the other one's on a private piece of property, and the local landowner-led group manages that compost facility. But the basic idea outside of calving is before this program, there were bone piles and boneyards. So if you have a dead stock, you drag it to the bone pile and get it away from the operation a little bit. Bone piles are highly attractive. Wolves and bears are attracted to those. They will stop by and see what's going on, right? And it can't bury stuff for bears. They'll dig it up 4 or 5 feet. One of our ranchers on the board member, he had a dead stock out of season. He thought, oh, this is okay, I'll just go bury it. For a couple of days later, came back, it was dug up, right? And he said, okay, that's it. And at this point now, it's a little bit of a peer-to-peer opportunity, because if you attract a bear into your operation, you're potentially attracting it into your neighbor. And so there's really an effort to say this needs to be a lot more participation, because we're really trying to have a less attractive place for predators. And from an NRCS perspective, they want predators to move through operations. They don't want to have a habitat sink, is what they call it. So they really like the idea of trying to move this practice forward, because they're really hearing from producers they'd like to get access to these techniques. And that would be some fencing technique, carcass pickup, composting, and range riding.